观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎回到明镜连线，我是主持人卓贤。据《华尔街日报今日报道，国务院一位高级官员表示，美国将要求进入朝鲜的东仓里卫星发射基地。尽管暂时还没有明确的证据显示这个设备基地可以开始运转，但是这会是美国消除朝鲜核武器以及远程导弹计划的一部分。而说到东仓里呢，东仓里是朝鲜一个被关闭了的导弹场所和卫星发射基地。这个发射场曾经被用作于卫星发射和测试液体燃料火箭的发动机。早在这周三的时候，就有消息传出来说，东仓里可能重新进入了运转。朝鲜这一举让外界进入了特别的紧急状态。特别是在川普在被问及朝鲜这一举的时候，他说，如果这是真的话，那么他对金正恩很失望，非常失望。纽约时报周三的时候就有报道说，美国军方分析人员和韩国情报官员表示，朝鲜在东仓里的重建计划包括了将卫星送入轨道计划和测试发动机，以及其他用于洲际导弹计划的技术发展。这些技术被预测为测试导弹的重要步骤。而根据专注朝鲜核问题的网站北韩38度周四公开的卫星照片显示呢，重建发射台的施工进展非常迅速。直到目前为止，将导弹转移到该发射台的一个建筑物似乎已经完工了。还有一个导弹发动机的测试台也已经完工，而这个重建计划似乎是在川金峰会开始之前就开始了进行。北韩38度还表示，考虑到这处发射场的建设以及其他的活动，这里似乎已经恢复到了正常的可运行状态。首尔东国大学研究朝鲜问题的教授高友焕对《纽约时报》表示，导弹技术设施的重新启动可能是朝鲜在寻求下一轮谈判之前增加筹码的做法。他倒认为，朝鲜不会冒着美韩恢复联合军事演习以及让美国人重新开始谈论军事选择的这个风险，马上去恢复导弹的试验。而我们今天的明镜连线嘉宾珍妮托恩 Jenny Town 正是北韩38度的执行主编，也是史汀生智库的韩国问题研究专家。在北韩38度关于东仓里最新发布的一篇评论文章表示，的确目前还没有任何明确的卫星图像去显示平壤有这么一个计划去发射任何东西，但是未来要发射导弹或者卫星的这个几率也不能说没有。明镜电视会持续为您关注朝鲜东仓里的后续报道，而今天的明镜连线呢，我们主要再一次回顾并分析川金峰会的始终，以及未来美韩关系可能的走向和无核化的实现的预期。那么在这里呢，我们先预告一下这位嘉宾的主要观点。我们的嘉宾托恩认为，关于峰会失败的原因，看起来双方在到达河内之前都对这个谈判的结果有了大致的预期，并且说好同意了一些的情况。可能发生的状况是，双方到达之后都提高了条件，并且要求提高到双方都不愿意接受。而这些新增的要求里面蕴含的细节，在短短的一天剩下的几个小时之内是谈不完的。他还说，这个谈判在某种意义上并不是失败，更应该说是一种试水，是让双方更加意识到对方的想法，并且他们不愿意放弃的是什么。而现在要关注的是，下一次的谈判开始还要多久？开始的越晚，代价就越高。其实最可行的是制定实实在在的工作计划，而不是开这些大张旗鼓的见面会。嘉宾托恩希望看到的是一份不需要太长远的协议书，但是会商议好短期的目标，比方说短期要做什么，中期的目标是什么等等。需要的是一份迈出第一步的计划去测试对方，而最简单的这个所谓的第一步，就是开始定义宁边是什么， 毁灭宁边原子设备中心意味着什么？哪些设备不可以扔掉？哪些设备可以保留？等等。那么以下，请听我们关于川金峰会后续的讨论。
I think the first biggest question that we've been talking about since the Hanoi summit is what exactly went wrong in the final moments between the two leaders? Do you think something unexpected has happened?
It is really hard to tell. Obviously, both sides have come out with their version of the story, and there are some discrepancies. What it does sound like is that leading up to the summit, there was a certain outline of a deal that both sides had agreed to or seemed to be moving towards agreement on, with some parts left to finish negotiating at Hanoi. And then once they got to Hanoi, I think both sides ended up raising the stakes, and raising them higher than what the other side was willing to accommodate at that time. And so these were asks that were so big to consider that it wasn't a matter of taking a couple more hours to try and hash things out, but there are real differences in what each side thought should be happening next. And so it's good that they didn't agree to those specific terms. However, it's unfortunate and it's disappointing that they didn't come to agreement on anything while they were there. And so we did still walk away with nothing.
Does it look strange to you, though? Because in summits like this, usually what we've heard about summits like this would be the two leaders have agreed on something and they just put together a very formal setting where they would just be sitting down signing a deal. And it seems like Trump has already scheduled a signing ceremony, but then it all just breaks down from there. Why do you think is that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is the typical way you deal with summits, is that this is meant to be the end of a process, or even after the end of a process, after you've started to implement and had some successes. Leaving this type of decision making to be done at a summit is very high stakes. I think you have two leaders who are have a very high risk tolerance, who thought they could, push the other further than what the other was really willing to do. This is not typical, and to do so at such a high-profile event is really unusual and somewhat unfortunate that they didn't postpone it until they had more time to consider what their options were and try and negotiate down to a point of compromise. So it certainly is unusual, and like I said, it does sound like that they were close to a deal before they got to Hanoi. And when they got there, both sides decided to roll the dice.
Right. So who do you think walked away first?
It's really unclear from the reporting out. It does sound like the North Koreans had a very specific idea of the types of sanctions relief that they wanted, which is considerably more than what was discussed before the summit. But whether they proposed that first or whether the U.S. started to up the ante first, it's kind of he said, she said at this point. But I think that the bigger point here is that, we're still not in agreement as to where we start the process, to be able to have some concrete measures to start working on to advance this agenda forward. And we're still, both sides still want a little bit more from each. And I just hope that at this point that the U.S. hasn't reverted back to the stance that everything needs to be agreed to up front in order to get anything. So, this all or nothing approach has always left us with nothing in the past. And I hope we can get back to this incremental approach and figure out what those first steps really are.
According to North Korea's foreign minister, it seems like they are not happy with a quote-unquote new request brought up by the U.S. Have you read about that report, and what do you think this new request could be?
Well, the reporting that's coming out was, for the types of sanctions and for the breadth of the sanctions relief that North Korea was asking for, yes, there are a lot of facilities at Yongbyon, and the majority of their fissile material production capability is housed at Yongbyon. But it isn't all of their fissile material production capability. And so, you know, there are a couple other sites that are suspected to be uranium enrichment sites.
Right.
And so for such a high price, the U.S. wanted a little bit more, and things that North Korea hasn't offered in the past. There is also some talk of that at that point they decided to ask for everything also. So, you know,
Right.
like give us all your nuclear weapons and all your, you know, everything, which of course is a non-starter. But I think, you know, I don't think they expected the North Koreans to come with such a big ask, even though it wasn't all sanctions. It was a very big portion of the sanctions, and especially the most recent sanctions that hit the commercial sectors. And so, yeah, I think they just were not even close to agreement on how, you know, what the reciprocal measures really should be in this type of arrangement.
There are also reports coming out from the U.S. State Department saying that it's because North Korea failed to clearly define what dismantling Yongbyon means. So what do you think at this point is North Korea unwilling to let go of? And do you think both sides can ever agree on what does dismantling Yongbyon mean?
Well, I mean, that is the heart of the matter here. The North Koreans have said they're willing to, you know, dismantle all of Yongbyon. I think if they could have agreed to that and then worked out the terms of that, really focused the discussions on, you know, is that every single facility at Yongbyon, and allowing inspections of all of the dismantlement, all the, you know, decommissioning and dismantlement process, I think, you know, that would have been a good step. But again, it's like what the U.S. was willing to offer even for that was much more limited than what the North Koreans thought the reciprocal measures should be. And so, you know, there really just wasn't agreement on that at all.
Would you define this summit as a fail, or are you more positive about what can come in the future?
Well, in the traditional concept of summit meetings, yes, because traditionally you would have the summit meeting to sign the agreement, but there wasn't an agreement to sign, and they didn't get to one while they were there. So in the traditional sense, yes, it was a failure. It doesn't necessarily mean diplomacy is over. I think both sides were very clear that the door for, you know, the window of opportunity here is still somewhat open. You know, they talked about you know, this was at least a productive conversation. I think they learned a little bit about, you know, what each other really want in this process, and especially as a first step in this process. The question will be, of course, while they both signaled the intention to continue negotiating and the political will to keep negotiating, the question is how much time are they going to take before they get back to the actual negotiations? Because I'm afraid the longer it takes to get back, the higher the risk that, you know, that the whole process really, the momentum deflates, and especially as President Trump gets bogged down in other domestic issues.
Right. So do you think the domestic issue that he was facing play a role in cutting the summit short?
I'm not sure it played a role in cutting the summit short. I think, you know, like I said, where they were at was not a matter of a couple more hours would have made a difference. I think, you know, they were at a point where there was a clear disagreement that needed more time to work out. But certainly, you know, the domestic situation doesn't help, and does work to, you know, distract the process, especially on the U.S. side, and can cause complications along the way. And I'm sure, you know, also calls into question some of the U.S. credibility as well in the implementation process. If you're North Korea looking at this too, thinking, well, you know, we don't want an all or nothing deal, because, you know, they're also very skeptical of the U.S. ability to implement as well, and especially when there's so much political turmoil going on for the president.
I think currently another point that the public is worried about is because there is no deal, so that means the Yongbyon complex still exists. So should we be worried about North Korea's nuclear possession at this moment? Because earlier last week when I talked to arms control expert, she warned that it's likely that North Korea has still been developing missile materials, nuclear materials in the past year that could be very dangerous. So what do you think about the potential threats?
I mean, that's the problem with not having at least a first stage deal, is that right now there are no obligations and no commitments on either side other than the commitment to keep negotiating. And so there's no country in which there's been these kind of arms control negotiations where one side unilaterally stops while the negotiations are going on to see what the terms of the agreement are going to be. So we would expect that North Korea will continue to develop their programs and continue to maintain their programs until an agreement is in place. And so, that means they do still have the capacity to produce more fissile material. They likely are still moving forward with fissile material production until there's something, a concrete agreement on the table. And the same with missile production, and the same with, the only thing they've agreed to is a moratorium on testing of missiles and nuclear weapons. And so it does limit some of their technological development beyond what they've already demonstrated, but it doesn't change the capacity that they have right now and the capabilities that they have right now.
Right. So what do you think is a more feasible way going forward? What would you hope to happen in the future?
Well, I think what we were expecting to see was something closer to what we've seen in the inter-Korean process, where, an agreement would come out of the summit that, wasn't a comprehensive all the way to the end of the road, all or nothing agreement, but really looked at, say, here's the next short-term, time-bounded time frame, a short-term work plan, some midterm goals to give some direction as to where this is going. And then, a recommitment to the overall agenda and to continue negotiating on the overall agenda. And I think what we really need is those, first concrete measures to test each other out. We need something to start restricting the program. We need something to start benchmarking progress. And that way, too, to be able to build a record of implementation and build a record of success in that process and build trust in that process in order to be able to get to the harder issues and the more core parts of North Korea's nuclear weapons program.
So, for example, what would that something be? What can be the very, very first step that both sides take?
Well, I mean, I think the expectation was the first step was Yongbyon. And again, if they had been able to get Yongbyon and define what all at Yongbyon was being, decommissioned, what all at Yongbyon was going to be dismantled, what that verification would look like, or at least an agreement to allow verification, which again would then get handed down to the working level negotiators to work out the details for, in exchange for, again, very specific things on the U.S. side. And we had heard things such as, an end of war declaration, an opening of liaison offices, and some, breathing space and exemptions on specific sanctions measures that would help the inter-Korean economic cooperation to really get started. And so that was kind of the outlines of the deal that was expected at Hanoi. And like I said, it's really disappointing to find out that at the end of the process, they were much further away than what we had anticipated.
Right. So is there something else that you want to add on this issue? Or, for example, do you hope people can pay more attention to certain issues around this topic?
Well, like I said, I think it's really important to understand that, the window for negotiations is still open. And both sides, left with fairly positive messages about continuing negotiating. But I think, the key is going to be how long it takes to get back to that negotiation. And I think the more we can kind of encourage that working level negotiation, not all this fanfare, but really, getting down to the details of here's what needs to be done to really get that first phase defined. And in order to be able to, again, start implementing and start testing each other and start putting restrictions and expectations and commitments down on paper, I think it's going to be very important for the sustainability of this process.
以上就是今天的明镜连线，感谢您收看明镜电视，我们下期再见。